President Lee Jae Myung's diplomatic schedule this week began with ASEAN-related meetings in Malaysia and is slated to end with his hosting of APEC leaders here in South Korea later this week. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Monday, October 27th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. We are looking ahead to a diplomatic super week, if you will, that began with a series of ASEAN-related summits for President Lee Jae Myung over in Malaysia ahead of his hosting of global leaders for the APEC Leaders Meeting in the southern city of Gyeongju later in the week. For more on this, I have Fabian Kretschmer with German press agency DPA here in the studio. Fabian, welcome.
Thank you.
I also have Professor Park Won-gon at Ewha Womans University live on the line. Professor Park, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Yes, thank you for having me here.
Right, Fabian, we will start in the studio. Let's begin with President Lee Jae Myung's diplomatic agenda in Malaysia, where the annual ASEAN event is taking place. Fabian.
Yeah, so President Lee Jae Myung left on Sunday from Songnam Air Base just south of Seoul to Malaysia for a two-day trip, and his schedule was very busy. So today he had the ASEAN summit, then he had the ASEAN +3 summit, which is a meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Sanei Takaichi and with Chinese Prime Minister Li Qiang. And then he also met on the sidelines, he had bilateral meetings with Malaysian head of state Anwar Ibrahim and with Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet. And the topics really were quite diverse. For example, with the Cambodian side, Lee Jae Myung addressed the issue of transnational crime. So the scam centers. People here in South Korea will know about this topic because it was very big in the news, but just a brief explanation. A lot of young South Koreans actually became victims. They were lured to Cambodia under fake job ads, and then they ended up basically under detention of crime families, criminal organizations, and then they were economically exploited. And one South Korean young man actually died because of torture from those criminal families. So, of course, that was a big issue for Lee Jae Myung, but he also addressed issues such as economic cooperation. He wants to increase trade with the ASEAN region, which is important for South Korea, also with increasing geopolitical tensions between the world powers. ASEAN could be a way to diversify trade. And then, of course, there are other issues like climate change, digital transformation, and so on.
Right, indeed. Professor Park, prior to his departure for Malaysia this past weekend, as Fabian mentioned, the local media here in South Korea spoke about how President Lee Jae Myung's first face-to-face with the newly elected Japanese Prime Minister Sanei Takaichi would be taking place in Malaysia. This being said, Professor Park, what are your thoughts with regard to bilateral ties under the new Japanese leadership?
Well, the relationship between South Korea and Japan has always been full of variables, issues such as history textbook, Dokdo, the first labor, and comfort of women have long been underlying source of tension between the two nations. So the real question is how we, South Korea and Japan, manage this historical and current dispute while still moving forward into the future. In that sense, President Lee Jae Myung's decision to visit Japan first before traveling to the United States carries great symbolic meaning. It reflects a willingness to acknowledge the treaties that both countries signed in the past and to take a future-oriented approach beyond the past grievances. So that's a very positive direction. Now it's Japan's turn to respond more actively. Prime Minister Takaichi Sanai is widely known as hardline conservative. Of course, being a prime minister is very different from being a parliament member. She has already emphasized the importance of South Korea and expressed her willingness to hold dialogue with President Lee, which shows that she recognized the value of the bilateral relationships. The key questions, however, will be whether she decided to personally visit the Yasukuni Shrine as she did in the past. I think it's more likely that she will refrain from visiting in person and instead offer a symbolic tribute, sending an offering rather than attending directly. In any case, the upcoming face-to-face encounter at the ARF meeting and possible Korea-Japan summit during the APEC gathering will be critical.
Right, and prior to the APEC gathering, Fabian, the Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi, is scheduled to sit down with U.S. President Donald Trump on Tuesday over in Tokyo. What looks to dominate their discussions?
I think the most important task for Sanae Takaichi is to establish a good personal relationship with Trump. That's important more than ever with Trump. I mean, he basically wants to get along with people, and then that also helps for those issues like trade, etc. And Takaichi has a good, I think, good advantage because she's a mentor of Shinzo Abe, the former or deceased Prime Minister of Japan, who got along with Trump very well. They shared a passion for golfing, for example. But just to give you some context, like the Japanese side, according to media reports, they bought a very unusual gift when Trump arrived. Namely, they want to buy a fleet, or want to present him a fleet of Ford pickup trucks. That's the model F-150, and that's supposedly a car that President Trump really likes. And so basically they put those cars there on the street, maybe a fleet for the government to use, but in my opinion that's kind of taxpayers' money, because in Japan the streets are very narrow, and the Ford pickup trucks, they are not made for this for narrow streets. They're actually too wide to use, so practically it doesn't make sense. But the Japanese side wants to say that we want to import US-made goods. We are kind of submissive to Trump's requests. I mean, I'm not judging here. I think that's a strategy that many countries are choosing, but it is kind of absurd. So basically the Japanese side does a lot to get the favor of Trump and also the sympathy of him. And Trump has also kind of a full schedule. He will visit a US aircraft carrier that's just outside of Japan. He will visit the business community and so on.
Right. And these talks in Tokyo, Professor Park, will be followed by a summit between President Lee Jae Myung and Mr. Trump here in South Korea on Wednesday. What looks to determine the success, if you will, of this particular summit?
Well, President Lee Jae Myung met with President Trump again just about 2 months after holding his first Korea-US summit at the White House in August. This follow-up meeting comes as the two sides have faced difficulty over how to manage to operate the $350 billion investment fund. In a written interview with the Straits Times of Singapore released on 24th, President Lee said that his administration is carefully reviewing the potential impact on the Korean financial markets and wary of setting any artificial deadlines. At the center of negotiation is the question about how much should count as direct investment. The U.S. is reportedly asking for around $25 billion a year for 8 years, totaling $200 billion in direct investments. On the other hand, Seoul is proposing less than $15 billion annually over a 10 years period. That's quite a large gap, and time, frankly, is on the Washington side. Korea's automobile industry is increasingly concerned. Since losing tariff-free benefit under the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, Korean automakers has to pay 25% tariff on export to the United States, 10 percentage point higher than Japan or European Union. As a result, Hyundai and Kia saw their operating profit drop by roughly 1.6 trillion won in the second quarter alone, and losses are expected to grow as inventories in the United States run out later this year. Given all this, it's crucial that some form of agreement be reached at this very summit.
Right, the summit that is slated to take place here in South Korea on Wednesday, of course. Fabian, on flight to Asia, Mr. Trump reaffirmed his willingness to meet with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. Could you tell us a bit more about the prospects of such an encounter?
Yeah, I mean, at least if it's up to Trump, then this meeting would take place. He said that he's open for it 100%. He gets along with Kim Jong-un very well, etc. But is it likely to happen? Well, actually, we know one little sign that recently the North Korean side in Panmunjom, I mean, at the inner Korean border, they did some cleanup work. For example, they were cutting the grass and, cleaning up the facilities for the first time this year. So you could interpret that maybe they will be prepared for all cases. But there's a lot that speaks against the possibility that such a meeting will take place. For one, right now the North Korean foreign minister is on her way to Moscow, Belarus. That basically shows that North Korean priorities are with Russia. But of course, I mean, that doesn't have to mean that a North Korean leader wouldn't be interested to meet Donald Trump. But I mean, so far, it's not part of Trump's schedule, and it's also not very likely in terms of what we hear from the South Korean side. From the presidential office, there are sources telling us that it's actually quite unlikely. And, a meeting also needs some prep work. You cannot just do it overnight, or maybe with Trump you could, who knows. But I would say the chances are relatively slim, but it's not impossible, and the South Korean government would actually be happy if this meeting takes place. The unification minister, for example, said this is a historic chance, you should use it, and he urged both sides, North Korea and USA, to use that chance. But of course, it takes two sides to tango, and so far we're not really sure if Kim Jong-un really wants that meeting to take place.
And Professor Park, what are your thoughts regarding the possibility of a Kim-Trump meeting this week, and what would be the potential gains of such an encounter, do you think?
Well, I basically agree to Fabian what he mentioned. I would personally estimate the likelihood that somewhere between 10 to 20% to meet these two leaders. Right now, the United States and North Korea are engaged in an intense power struggle outside the negotiation table. President Trump continued to stress that he has such a good relationship with Kim Jong-un and has repeatedly expressed his willingness to meet again. In contrast, Kim Jong-un made his own position very clear during his speech at the Supreme People's Assembly on September 21st. He laid out two key conditions. First, the United States should at least declaratively shift from the denuclearization talks to nuclear arms reduction talks. And second, the Washington must end its hostile policy toward Pyongyang, beginning with the suspension of joint military exercise and the deployment of the strategic asset on the Korean Peninsula. Interestingly, while en route to the ASEAN Regional Forum, President Trump was asked by reporters whether he would recognize North Korea as a nuclear-armed state. He replied that he considered North Korea a sort of nuclear power. It was an ambitious statement, but one that clearly left the door open, effectively echoing Kim's long-standing demand. So now the ball is back in the North Korean court. From the Pyongyang's perspective, there are two considerations. First, if they completely refuse the meeting, they risk provoking a return to the kind of a hardline policy we saw from Trump in year 2017. Second, if they agree to meet, Kim could use that opportunity to enhance his international statures, showing that within a single year he has met with a world leader like Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump. However, the conditions still don't seem right. The venue remains uncertain, and fundamentally, North Korea believed that the year 2018-2019 summit ended up being a political trap set by Trump. For that reason, I think the chance of another meeting actually taking place are still quite low.
Right, I see. Fabian, also making international headlines as we speak is the planned summit between Mr. Trump and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping here in South Korea this coming Thursday. What more has been shared about the agenda of these upcoming talks?
I would say the dynamics between the US and China has quite drastically changed after this weekend. In Malaysia, there were trade talks on minister level. Scott Bessent from the US side and He Lifeng from the Chinese side. And, we didn't expect much, or most observers didn't expect much from these trade talks. I mean, they were a prelude for the summit that will happen in South Korea. But actually, on Sunday evening, Lee Cheung-gang, that's one of the negotiators from the Chinese side, actually the leading negotiator, he said, we came to a preliminary agreement. I really looked that statement up several times. I couldn't believe my eyes because, wow, an agreement, what does that mean? And then Scott Bessent went to the media and he backed that up and said, you know, we set a successful framework for this summit between Xi and Trump to happen on Thursday. And when you look into the rhetoric, basically both sides have kind of found compromises in all the topics that they were fighting about. Curbing fentanyl, I mean, the opioid that, you know, a lot of the chemical precursors come from Chinese labs. I mean, of course, that's in the US interest to really fight against that drug export, so to speak. Then, of course, the Chinese side has signaled that they will buy more soybeans. That is important for Trump, also with his voter base, which consists of a lot of farmers. Then it seems that the Chinese side has also is delaying or is reviewing its curb on export controls of rare earths. That is very important for the US, but I think also for the rest of the world. I mean, all those issues, there was progress was made. So I expect that on Thursday, when Xi and Trump meet, it will be rather harmonious, and both sides will pronounce a big deal. Probably Trump will do that very, showman-like how he is. And this deal, of course, has already put a lot of euphoria into the markets. If you're exposed to the stock market, you could already see some upward movement. But of course, with those high expectations, I mean, maybe we could be in for some disappointment on Thursday because nothing has been set in stone yet. We don't know exactly, and that's the final answer to your question, we don't know exactly what they will talk about, but I would expect after what we've seen from the weekend that it will be rather a positive surprise.
Right. Details of that, of course, as you mentioned, will be revealed on October 30th, that is Thursday. The stock market, like you were saying, the South Korean stock market surpassed 4,000 on this Monday. Professor Park, the Chinese leader's upcoming trip to South Korea is the first in over a decade, 11 years to be precise. His last trip here was back in 2014. What do you believe are the broader implications of this state visit for bilateral ties?
Well, according to the presidential office, there are a number of important issues on the agenda because Korea and China are partners, and two sides are expected to discuss ways to deepen the economic cooperation as well as regional security, the Korean Peninsula and North Korea. Cooperation on protecting Korean citizens in China and expanding people-to-people exchange is also being considered. There is also speculation that President Lee Jae Myung will use this meeting to explain his vision for North Korean policy known as the END initiative, which stands for exchange, normalization, and denuclearization. So far, Pyongyang has shown little interest, but Seoul is hoping Beijing can play a constructive role in encouraging engagement. Beijing, in turn, is expected to present its own perspective on the Taiwan issue and regional stability. There are also growing attention on whether the two leaders will discuss China's recent sanction against Hana Ocean's U.S. subsidiaries, and which was blacklisted earlier this month as part of U.S.-China tensions. Other bilateral issues, including China's export on control on rare earth materials and the dispute over large steel structures installed by China in the West Sea's provisional maritime zones. Given the current sharp U.S.-China rivalry, China's recent effort to strengthen ties with North Korea following Kim Jong-un's visit to Beijing, the summit will likely focus more on stabilizing the relationship rather than announcing both new initiatives.
Right, and that summit between South Korea and the Chinese leaders is slated to take place on Saturday, that is November 1st. All right, Professor Park, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
And Fabian, thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.